High altitude, 27,000 feet. Above this frozen threshold, the sky is no longer blue, but a deep, bruised purple. It is a realm of thin air and lethal silence, broken only by the angry snarl of piston engines. April 8, 1943. Above the fields of occupied France, the masters of this domain, the aces of Germany's Luftwaffe, circle like eagles. They are the most experienced, most lethal fighter force the world has ever seen. Veterans of a war they have dominated for 4 bloody years. Through the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican watches a new enemy approach. They are not the elegant Spitfires or the nimble fighters of the Eastern Front. These are different. Laboring upwards, their silhouettes are thick, brutish, almost agricultural. Hermican keys his radio, a laugh creeping into his voice. Look at them! They send us flying milk bottles. Below, in the cramped cockpits of the 4th Fighter Group, American pilots grip their controls. They are flying the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, 7 tons of American industry, powered by the largest engine ever strapped to a single-seat fighter. To the Germans, it is a joke, a fat, clumsy target, a testament to American ignorance of aerial combat. What they don't know, what no one could possibly know, is that they are not looking at a mistake. They are looking at their own extinction. This is not the story of a dogfight. It is the story of an industrial apocalypse. The story of how the laughter of aces turned into a shriek of terror, and how a machine mocked as a flying milk bottle would become the most feared sound in the German sky. This is the story of the Juggernaut. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt does not begin in the sky. It begins on the ground in the summer of 1940, in a state of sheer panic. France had fallen. The Royal Air Force was fighting for its life over Britain, and the United States Army Air Corps looked at its own fleet of fighters and saw a catastrophe waiting to happen. Their best aircraft, like the P-40 Warhawk, were already outclassed, incapable of fighting the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s at the high altitudes where the air war in Europe was being decided. The call went out for a new interceptor, a lightweight, high-performance machine that could climb fast and turn tight. A scalpel to meet the scalpels of the Luftwaffe. The call went to Republic Aviation and to its chief designer, a Georgian-born genius named Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli looked at the Army's request for a lightweight interceptor. He looked at the performance of the German fighters. And he looked at a new engine sitting in a workshop. A monster of engineering called the Pratt. Entitinaoit sa Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. An 18-cylinder radial engine that produced a staggering 2,000 horsepower. Kartveli understood a fundamental truth that would define the American war effort. America didn't win by fighting smarter. It won by fighting bigger, by overwhelming the enemy with brute force. He threw the plans for a lightweight fighter in the trash. He was going to build a warplane around that engine. His design team was horrified. The plans showed not a fighter, but a Leviathan to accommodate the engine and its revolutionary turbo supercharger, a complex system of ducts and turbines that would allow the engine to breathe in the thin air of the stratosphere. The E fuselage had to be immense, barrel-chested, almost pregnant in its shape. Kartveli. It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions. On May 6, 1941, the prototype, the XP-47B, took to the skies for the first time. The men on the ground who watched it were stunned. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, 65% more than its predecessor. Its wings seemed too small for its colossal body. Test pilots walking up to it for the first time were known to ask the same bewildered question. This thing actually flies. It flew. But it was less a flight and more a controlled explosion. The torque from its massive propeller could flip the plane on takeoff. Its sheer weight made landings a terrifying ordeal. And in a dive, it built up speed with such ferocious momentum that pilots discovered a new and deadly phenomenon: compressibility. Shock waves would form on the wings, the controls would freeze solid, and the Dinosaur would plunge toward the Earth, suddenly and horribly extinct. This was the machine sent to the 56th Fighter Group for training in late 1942. Their commander, Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a tough, no-nonsense leader, initially despised it. His pilots, many of them fresh-faced kids, were used to lighter, more forgiving trainers. The Thunderbolt was a beast. It didn't forgive. It killed. Between September 1942 and January 1943, before a single P-47 had faced a German fighter, the 56th Fighter Group lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. The Juggernaut was killing more Americans than the entire Luftwaffe would in its first months of combat. It was a widowmaker, a death trap, a 7-ton nightmare. But for the few pilots who could tame it, who learned to wrestle it into submission, they discovered a secret. They felt a power that was almost primal. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would one day become one of America's greatest aces, described his first flight. Johnson: "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power, it was unbelievable. You didn't fly it. You aimed it. Aiming it was one thing. Fighting in it was another." When the first P-47s arrived in England in early 1943, the reception from their British allies was polite skepticism. RAF pilots, accustomed to the balletic grace of the Spitfire, privately joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the spacious cockpit. The first combat. Missions in April and May 1943 were a brutal confirmation of everyone's worst fears. The Thunderbolt was a disaster. It couldn't climb with the Messerschmitt 109s. It couldn't turn with the Focke-Wulf 190s. At medium altitudes, where most dogfights occurred, it handled like a cargo truck. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned how to dismantle them. They would attack from below, where the heavy P-47s struggled to climb. They would bait the Americans into turning fights, dancing around the lumbering giants and cutting them to pieces with cannon fire. Joseph Pips Priller, a legendary German ace, filed a report that perfectly summarized the German view. Priller: "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indiana, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics were grim. In their first month of operations, the American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in exchange for just 3 confirmed German kills. The Great American Hope was a failure. The Dinosaur was too big, too slow, too heavy for the modern aerial battlefield. But amidst the losses and the despair, something strange was happening. Something the German intelligence reports failed to fully appreciate. The P-47s that were shot down, they didn't die easily. One Thunderbolt limped back to base with 21 cannon holes and over 100 machine gun strikes, an attack that would have vaporized a Spitfire. The massive radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engines in German fighters, had no vulnerable coolant system. It could take direct hits and keep running. The pilots were protected by a thick slab of armor plating behind their seat. The entire aircraft was, in the words of its designer, overbuilt, a flying fortress with a single seat. The Germans saw a flaw. The Americans were beginning to see a strength, but it would take one pilot, trapped and alone in a shattered cockpit, to prove to the world that the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness was also its most terrifying advantage. June 26, 1943. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron is flying at the tail end of a formation of 48 Thunderbolts, returning from an escort mission. The sky is clear. The mood is relaxed. Too relaxed. Suddenly, the sky erupts. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s, led by the brother of the famous ace Adolf Galland, execute a perfect ambush, diving out of the sun. Johnson's P-47 is caught in a hail of fire from multiple attackers. The world explodes. 21 20mm cannon shells tear through his aircraft. The canopy shatters. Hot hydraulic fluid sprays into the cockpit, blinding him. The engine cowling is ripped away. Fire erupts behind the instrument panel. Johnson is wounded, his nose and leg peppered with shrapnel. His first instinct is survival, bail out. He grabs the handle to jettison the canopy, but it won't budge. A cannon shell has exploded in the track, welding it shut. He is trapped in a burning, disintegrating aircraft 5 miles above the Earth. This is the end. For any other pilot, in any other fighter, the story would end here. But this is a P-47 Thunderbolt. What happened next would become legend. Through the oil-smeared windscreen, Johnson could see nothing. The engine shook so violently it threatened to tear itself from the wings. The controls barely responded. Yet, somehow, he wrestled the dying beast level and pointed its nose toward England. The Juggernaut refused to die. Then, it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 spots, the crippled bomber fighter limping home. The German pilot, his identity lost to history, sees an easy kill. He settles in behind Johnson's helpless aircraft and opens fire. Johnson can do nothing but huddle behind his armor plate and pray as rounds hammer into his plane. The German pilot empties his entire cannon ammunition load into the Thunderbolt. Still, it flies. He repositions and fires again, this time with just his machine guns. Again, the P-47 absorbs the punishment. In disbelief, the German pilot pulls up alongside the flying wreck. Johnson can see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something that looked like fear. What was holding this thing together? The German pilot makes one last pass, emptying his remaining ammunition into the shredded fuselage. Still, the Thunderbolt lumbers on. Finally, out of ammunition and out of ideas, the German pilot pulls alongside one last time, shakes his head in amazement, gives Johnson an informal salute, and peels away. Robert Johnson's P-47 crash-landed at Manston Airfield in England, its engine seizing on the runway. The ground crew chief stopped counting the bullet holes when he reached 200. A cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. 3 of the 4 main structural beams of the fuselage were shot clean through. The aircraft should have been a cloud of metal confetti over the English Channel. Instead, it brought its pilot home. The story of Johnson's flight sent shockwaves through both air forces. German intelligence, reading the combat reports, initially refused to believe it. It was impossible. American engineers, studying the wreckage, realized they had built something far tougher than they had ever imagined. The mockery was starting to fade. The Germans had learned that the Thunderbolt was hard to kill. They were about to learn something far more terrifying. They were about to learn how it killed. The pilots of the USF were finally beginning to understand the monster they were flying. They had been trying to use it as a scalpel, a fencer's rapier. But the P-47 was not a rapier. It was a sledgehammer, and they were about to learn how to swing it. The return of Robert Johnson's shattered Thunderbolt was more than a miracle. It was a revelation. In the halls of the 8th Air Force Command and in the smoky ready rooms of its fighter groups, a new understanding began to dawn. They had been looking at their greatest liability, the P-47's immense weight, all wrong. They saw it as a burden that kept them from turning and climbing. They now realized it was a reservoir of potential energy, a weapon in itself. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, had seen enough of his men die trying to fight a European air war in an American machine. Through brutal trial and error, he forged a new doctrine, a set of commandments hammered out in the unforgiving skies over France. Zemke. Don't turn with a 190. Don't try to outclimb a 109. They will kill you every time. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. And above all, dive. This was the key. In a dive, the 7-ton Thunderbolt was untouchable. Its mass, a curse in a climb, became an unstoppable force when pointed toward the Earth. A P-47, diving from 30,000 feet, could blast past 500 miles per hour, exceeding the structural limits of the lighter German fighters. It could strike and escape before the enemy even had time to react. This principle gave birth to a tactic that would become the Thunderbolt's deadly signature. Pilots called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. History knows it as boom and zoom. P-47 formations would climb to the stratosphere, to 30,000 feet or higher, where their turbo-supercharged engines gave them a critical advantage. They would patrol above the fight, like patient predators. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below to attack the bomber streams, the Thunderbolts would roll over and plunge downwards. They came down like hammers from heaven. At these speeds, deflection shooting was impossible for the defending Germans. They were not fighting an aircraft. They were dodging a meteor. And at the bottom of that dive, as the P-47 pulled out of its plunge, its pilot would unleash the true soul of the machine. The mathematics of destruction were stored in its wings. 8 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, a weapon not of finesse, but of overwhelming industrial-scale violence. Unlike the slow-firing cannons of German fighters, which carried limited ammunition, the American guns were a torrent. 4 guns in each wing, their lines of fire precisely calibrated to intersect several hundred yards ahead of the aircraft. They didn't create a stream of bullets. They created a solid wall of lead, a convergence zone 6 feet in diameter, where 100 armor-piercing incendiary projectiles arrived every single second. Aircraft caught in this storm didn't fall from the sky. They ceased to exist. Wings were not damaged. They were amputated. Cockpits were not penetrated. They were shredded into metallic confetti. Pilots who survived described it not as being shot at, but as flying into a solid object. The first true demonstration of this terrifying new reality came on August 17, 1943. The USAAF launched its most ambitious and dangerous mission to date, a deep penetration, double-strike raid against the critical ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The mission was a crucible for the bomber crews, but for the P-47 pilots tasked with escorting them as far as their fuel would allow, it was a coming-out party. Major David Schilling, leading a squadron from the 56th, spotted a formation of German Me-110 Zerstörer destroyers. These were heavy, twin-engine fighters, laden with cannons and rockets, designed specifically to slaughter the B-17s. They were the wolves of the Luftwaffe. But now, the wolves were the prey. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. A gunner in one of the Me-110s, who survived to be interrogated, recounted the horror. German gunner, the American fighters. They did not attack. They fell on us. I saw my tracers strike one fighter's wing. It did not even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft in front of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. In 2 seconds, a Zerstörer became nothing. In less than a minute, Schilling's 4 P-47s annihilated 8 of the specialized bomber killers. German pilots, who had never encountered such concentrated firepower, were stunned. Their tactics, their training, their entire understanding of air combat was rendered obsolete in a matter of seconds. The Americans had a machine that could absorb impossible punishment. Now, they had a tactic that delivered it. But the Thunderbolt's evolution was just beginning. It was about to claim the one place the Luftwaffe thought was theirs alone, the high frontier. The secret to the P-47's dominance lay in a piece of technology the Germans couldn't match: the turbo supercharger. While German fighters relied on mechanical superchargers driven directly by the engine, the Thunderbolt's was powered by its own exhaust gases. This system allowed the R-2800 engine to breathe as if it were at sea level, even in the thin, freezing air 6 miles up. Above 25,000 feet, a strange inversion of power occurred. The nimble Messerschmitts and powerful Focke-Wulfs began to choke. Their engines lost power. Their controls grew sluggish. The P-47, meanwhile, came alive. The pregnant cow of medium altitudes became a thoroughbred in the stratosphere. This new reality would be written in the blood of Germany's finest. On October 8, 1943, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a legendary ace with 206 victories, led his squadron against B-17s over Bremen. At 28,000 feet, his Focke-Wulf 190 was struggling, its powerful engine gasping for air. From above, at 32,000 feet, came the 56th Fighter Group. Among them was Robert Johnson, now a seasoned combat pilot. Johnson spotted Phillips' distinctively painted aircraft and rolled into a dive. There was no dogfight. There was only an execution. Johnson's combat report was brutally clinical. Johnson opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. The death of Hans Philipp sent a tremor through the Luftwaffe. If an ace of his caliber, a veteran of over 500 missions, could be swatted from the sky so effortlessly, what chance did anyone else have? A German high command investigation confirmed their fears. The Thunderbolt could fly higher, dive faster, and was armored like a tank. Most disturbing of all, its 8 guns carried nearly 3,400 rounds of ammunition, enough for over 30 seconds of continuous fire. An eternity in a dogfight. The weapon the Germans had mocked was now defining the terms of engagement, and it was about to get even deadlier. In January 1944, a new variant began arriving in England, the P-47D-22. It featured a single, transformative upgrade, a new Hamilton Standard propeller with massive broad paddle blades. This new propeller bit into the air with ferocious efficiency. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Thunderbolt's greatest remaining weakness, its sluggish climb rate, was largely erased. The new variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or even exceeding their German counterparts at most altitudes. Hauptmann Heinz Knocke, a veteran German pilot, encountered the new P-47s in February. His diary entry captures the shock and dread spreading through the Luftwaffe. Knocke. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced to formation, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the Thunderbolt's voice. The blade tips, now moving at supersonic speeds, created a deep, thundering roar that could be heard for miles. German ground troops, who learned to identify aircraft by sound, gave it a new name: Donnerschlag. The thunderclap. It was a sound that meant death was coming from above. With improved performance came increased range. Equipped with external drop tanks, the once short-legged escort could now travel over 1,000 miles. Thunderbolts could now fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, carrying the fight deep into the heart of the Reich. The Luftwaffe was now caught in an impossible trap. To stop the bombers, they had to fly through the P-47 escort screen. But to fly through the P-47s was suicide. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 victories, survived an encounter on March 6, 1944. He recalled the experience after the war. Röhl L. We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone on the radio laughed and said, "Here come the flying pigs." Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters. Just gone. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death. The balance of power had shifted. The Juggernaut was no longer a clumsy defender. It had become a peerless, high-altitude predator, a systematic destroyer of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. But its transformation was not yet complete. As the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, the P-47 was about to descend from the cold stratosphere to the mud and fire of the battlefield. It had conquered the sky. Now, it was coming for the ground. By the spring of 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had conquered the stratosphere. It had evolved from a clumsy joke into the Luftwaffe's most feared high-altitude predator. But as the new, long-legged P-51 Mustang began to take over the primary bomber escort role, a new destiny awaited the Juggernaut. Its war at 30,000 feet was ending. Its war at 300 feet was about to begin. Unleashed from its escort duties, the Thunderbolt was sent down to the deck, tasked with attacking the German war machine on the ground. It was a role for which its design philosophy, brute force, overwhelming firepower, and extreme durability, was perfectly suited. The Germans had a word for these fighter-bombers: Jabos. But what the P-47 became was something far beyond that. It became flying artillery. Its 850 caliber guns, so devastating against fighters, proved equally catastrophic against ground targets. A 2-second burst could shred a supply truck, ignite a fuel depot, or sweep the deck of an anti-aircraft position. But now this formidable gun platform was augmented. The D-25 variant could carry two 1,000-pound bombs and a 500-pounder on its center line, a bomb load equal to a light bomber from just a few years earlier. It could also be armed with 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each delivering the explosive punch of an artillery shell with the accuracy of a sniper's rifle. The experience for the German soldier on the ground was apocalyptic. Oberst Hans von Luck, a commander in the Normandy campaign, witnessed the Thunderbolt's fury firsthand. Von Luck. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was a terror all its own. Then the hammer of those guns. An entire column of our trucks. It simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in a single pass. The effect on the men was devastating. This was not war. It was extermination from the sky. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the full scale of this new threat was revealed. Over 500 P-47s formed a steel umbrella over the invasion beaches. The Luftwaffe, attempting to intervene, was massacred. One German pilot, one of only a handful to even reach the beaches that day, reported that the sky simply belonged to the Americans, with thunderbolts stacked from sea level to the stratosphere. In the weeks that followed, P-47 systematically strangled the German army in France. They owned the daylight. Any German unit that dared to move between sunrise and sunset was erased. The statistics compiled by the 9th Air Force were not just numbers. They were a death warrant for the Wehrmacht. In June alone, Thunderbolts were credited with destroying over 600 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, and more than 500 tanks and armored vehicles. The Germans were paralyzed, forced to move only under the cover of darkness. The Juggernaut, which had begun the war as a high-altitude interceptor, was now the single greatest impediment to German ground operations in the West. And its reign of terror was not limited to Europe. In the vast expanses of the Pacific, the Thunderbolt's qualities proved equally decisive. Its rugged construction and air-cooled engine were perfectly suited to the harsh, primitive conditions. Japanese pilots, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile aircraft, were unprepared for the monster from America. Their cannon shells, which could rip apart a P-40, seemed to just bounce off the P-47's armored hide. The final variant, the P-47N, was a marvel of endurance, with internal wing tanks that stretched its range to over 2,000 miles, far enough to escort B-29 superfortresses on their raids against the Japanese mainland. The stubby-winged joke of 1943 had evolved into a true intercontinental weapon. But the Thunderbolt's ultimate victory was not won in the sky, or even on the battlefield. It was won on the factory floor. The P-47 was not just an aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial might. Republic Aviation produced 15 183 Thunderbolts. At the peak of production, a new P-47 rolled off the assembly line every single hour, 24 hours a day. Germany, meanwhile, was collapsing. Its factories were bombed-out ruins, its resources exhausted. This disparity was thrown into brutal relief on January 1, 1945. In a final, desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a massive surprise attack by nearly 900 fighters against Allied airfields. At Airfield Y-34, home to the 365th Fighter Group, the attack was a success. German fighters swept in at dawn, destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground. A captured German pilot, brought before the American commander, Major George Brooking, gestured to the burning aircraft with a triumphant smirk. "German pilot, what do you think of that?" Brooking's reply became a legend in the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already clearing the wreckage. "Fiend, by tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk vanished. He understood. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 irreplaceable veteran pilots in that single morning. The Americans replaced their aircraft in less than a week. It was a war of attrition Germany could never win. They were not fighting an air force. They were fighting an avalanche. This avalanche included pilots. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots a year. Each one arrived in Europe with over 400 hours of flight training. By the war's end, new German pilots were being sent into combat with less than 100 hours total. They were lambs being sent to a slaughterhouse made of steel and lead. In March 1945, Oberleutnant Josef Priller, the very same ace who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, gave an interview to propaganda officials. His assessment, deemed too demoralizing to publish, revealed the complete and utter transformation in the German mindset. P-E-L-R. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented, but beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one, it is gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. We laughed at them in 1943. We are not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. They did not beat us. They buried us. By May of 1945, the war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air arm in the world, had ceased to exist. The final statistics of the P-47 service record are difficult to comprehend. In Europe alone, its pilots destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They wiped out 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 70,000 trucks. They achieved this with a kill ratio of 4.6 to 1, while suffering the lowest loss rate of any major Allied fighter. The journey was complete. The flying milk bottle had become the instrument of annihilation. At a post-war reunion, General Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked about the Thunderbolt. "Galland, we made a terrible mistake. We saw this big, heavy fighter and we laughed. We were the ones who did not understand. The Americans built an American fighter designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver it back tenfold would win. They were right. The P-47 did not just defeat the Luftwaffe. It destroyed it. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever built. It was a brute, a dinosaur from an age of industrial titans. It was born in panic, forged in failure, and baptized in the fire of combat. It entered the war as an object of derision, and ended it as an icon of absolute power. The German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in the spring of 1943. By the spring of 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.